folks. Welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show, comedy on Power Talk. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today. And oftentimes on this journey, after 11 years, you wind up coming back in connection with spirits that really helped you on the path to begin with. And I get a chance today to speak to somebody who's been on the bandstand for quite a long time, and honestly is somebody who showed a lot of confidence in me, just in the sense that he was with me early on when I was still searching for my voice, and offered me a lot of great stories and also a lot of perspective. And I didn't really have my voice at that time, but after 11 years and speaking to his younger brother recently, Terry Silverlight, I recognized that so much of the time period now that I've become kind of focused on is a period that, well, actually, what Terry was saying was, you should really reach out to my brother because he probably could answer some of this stuff much better than I, because he was on the scene much earlier than him. Regardless, his music has stood the test of time. He was the first electric fusion musician. A lot of people would say the first fusion musicians was Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie, but this man is an icon of music and still doing it. Barry Miles, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to ask you, Barry, about where you came down on. There's this sort of intoxicating period that I've identified, which is essentially the early 60s, 61, 62, where you had these conversational piano trios with Don Friedman, or obviously Bill Evans at the Vanguard. And the thing about the Evans recording with LaFaro and Paul Motian, I could play that every day, and every time I put it on, it sounds different. And I wanted you to talk about the conversational piano trios of the early 60s and how it influenced you in your own composition.
Well, that music is really timeless, and you're right. You listen to it, and it's harmonically interesting, rhythmically interesting, and the rapport between the musicians is very, very strong. So this was something that, I have to go back a little bit before that to sort of explain how I got to some of that music.
Sure.
I did a lot of piano music in the 60s and in the early 70s. But where my influences came from, especially on that conversational, almost like what they called free-form music or whatever.
Yeah.
Really goes back to, I think, my first influence of that type of music, which wasn't necessarily a piano trio, but, that concept goes back to about 1955 with Chico Hamilton.
Wow.
Great drummer. And I remember when I was a kid, I was born in 1947, and this album came out in 1955, so I was probably 8, 9 years old when I heard it. And it was just called the Chico Hamilton Quintet. It was on Pacific Jazz Records, and it had an interesting combination of Buddy Collette on flute and clarinet and saxophone. Jim Hall was on guitar. Fred Katz played cello, and I think Carson Smith was the bass player.
Yeah, Putter's brother, right? Yeah, that's unbelievable.
There was one song in particular on there which was called Free Form, and it was total free improvisation. So this is 1955, and it's basically, that album came out before the Ornette Coleman album, which is probably the next year, 1956, something else. And it really, struck a chord with me, that Chico Hamilton, that you could incorporate. In other words, you could do the conversational style between musicians without even having a preconceived form, like a set of chord changes or whatever. So the musicians really were on the spot to be able to improvise in that manner, and it was the rapport between them. Now, there were players who did that same kind of free-form music during that period of time and a little bit after that, but themselves. In other words, some of the music of another person who who influenced me a lot is a man who's still around, wonderful musician, Rand Blake. I don't know
Oh
if
my
you're familiar.
dude, I've been trying to track him down, man. Dude, that dude is a legend, man.
Right, and I worked with him.
Wow.
This is in the 50s, probably around the time of Elvis Presley, because I remember when I was a kid, we stayed over my parents' house, and we did a concert together. I think we even played like two pianos, back and forth.
Oh,
and
I love this.
But a lot of solo piano work, and I guess probably around the same time he was just starting with Jeannie Lee, who was the singer, and they both were students at Bard College. And this would be, 1957,
Wow.
1958. I'm not
Holy cow.
sure. And he, as a student, he put on a jazz festival at Bard College, and I remember he even had Kenny Dorham was playing on it, and I played on it, as well, and that was, big influence for me. But then after that, we did some concerts together, and he was very much into freeform playing, and so that was a big influence, for me at that time. Now, of course, I heard the other people who were doing that, like Lenny Tristano, and then Dennis Sandoli was, into that during that period of time. So, I'm not answering your question directly as far as, the piano trio conversational style, but that really comes out of what happened like in the mid to late 50s and then on into the very early 60s. Another great album that influenced me a lot was the Charlie Mingus album on Candid Records called Mingus Presents Mingus. And he did a lot of free improvisation on there, and that whole conversational style, like between him, the players on there were Eric Dolphy, and Ted Kurson, and Danny Richmond on. There was no piano on that, but that kind of conversational style, to the point where there was one piece where they did, I think it was, what did he call it, What Love, which was sort of based on the chord changes of what is this thing called love.
Sure.
And it breaks down in a certain place, and he does this duet with Eric Dolphy playing bass clarinet and Mingus on bass, and they're basically talking to each other through the instruments, and it's not even kind of like a, it's conversational. It's like, the bass goes like doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, and the saxophone says doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, and they sort of go back and forth, and then they get into a scuffle, and it's it's so clever, it's so beautiful, and that that really again struck a chord with me, and some of those players, during that period of time in the early 60s, I did a lot of things, not necessarily all with piano trio, but with a quintet, and some of those players were like Woody Shaw and McIntyre and Gomez, and we did a lot of there were actual compositions that I wrote and some standards, but there was a lot of free improvisation involved with that. And then I remember with Woody Shaw, this would have been around 1964. He wanted to. He was very young at that time. He was either, I wouldn't say fresh out of high school, but real close to it in his very early 20s. And a call to go to Europe to play with Eric Dolphy. And before he could do the gig, Dolphy passed away. So this would have been in 1964. And then Woody Shaw stayed over there. I think he worked like with Nathan Davis. I remember he said he was going to play at a club in Paris called Le Chat qui pêche, which means the cat who fishes or whatever. And I didn't see Woody Shaw for quite some time after that until later in the 70s. And but we did a lot of playing together. I even have somewhere some recordings.
No, I was going to say we got to get those. I mean, that I cannot believe. Barry Miles, were you playing drums in that quartet?
Yes, and that's the other thing. Like I really didn't switch completely to piano on gigs until sort of like the mid 60s, 66 or something.
Yeah.
And then a lot of that changed when my brother Terry, who's 10 years younger than me, he sort of picked up where I left off on the drums and went to a whole different direction. But that's when I sort of, was doing piano full time. So the people who were playing in my band at that time, all kinds of musicians who went through that, like Richard Davis, who also played with Eric Dolphy and Booker Little and Woody Shaw. And as I mentioned, Eddie Gomez. I remember Chick Corea played a little bit, rehearsed with us. There was a whole group of very young musicians. David Eisenson, the bass player who played with Ornette Coleman, recorded with Ornette. So there was a lot going on at that time, and that whole style, which is pre-fusion in a way, but it's sort of like, that really was a fusion of a lot of different styles. And of course, the other music going on at that time was what they called third stream with Gunther Schuller. So there was so much experimentation at that time. But it's the prerequisite for, playing, in a free form. You really had to know the past. You couldn't just sort of like shuck and jive and just like you can't really play and you're just,
sure,
because you don't know, you had to have, the context and the knowledge of the music that preceded you. And all of those players that I mentioned, they all did or do,
Barry, no, I mean, I want to ask you, because like LaFaro, a lot of the rock and R&B guys from the Bay Area and even just, they were like, wow, this guy, listen to this guy, man. He's playing like the bass like a lead instrument. And I just wonder, because conversationally, how much responsibility did Chico and Carson Smith or Mingus and Danny Richmond, how responsible were the rhythm sections for creating that improvisational style?
Oh, it was like really, really important because, just to be able to, to understand the basis of that, to be able to, because a lot of it wasn't necessarily what they called, in tempo or in time. Some of it was.
Right.
And in other words, you really be able to switch gears very quickly as a rhythm player, both in the bass and both, specifically in the drums. And you can really hear that on that album that I mentioned, Mingus Presents Mingus, which is, I think, 1961 or 1960. And there's all kinds of things going on there, but the rhythm section really had to be in sync with one another. In other words, you really had to listen. You couldn't just like go off on your own, and you contributed your ideas, but it was definitely a communal, a musical conversation. But someone like Scott LaFaro was like just technically a master. I did get a chance to sit in with him once.
Wow.
When this is all before Bill Evans. He was working at a place. I must have been like, I'd say like 10 years old.
And wait, you were 10 years old? You were 10 years old?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So my dad, I was born in Newark, New Jersey, but we moved to North Plainfield, New Jersey, which was sort of a suburb, maybe 20 miles away or something. But he used to take me to a club in Newark called Sugar Hill. And it was named after, like the area in Harlem.
Sure,
and it
sure.
was a jazz club, and all kinds of musicians in there, like that came and played, like Max Roach and Roy Eldridge. And I did get a chance to sit in with Roy Eldridge, and they wouldn't have done this if I wasn't any good. I mean, they knew, that I even at that age. Anyhow, Chet Baker was working, did a gig at Sugar Hill, and my dad took me to see him. And Scott LaFaro was playing bass, and Phil Urso was the sax player, and I can't recall who was, the actual, drummer on the gig. And, and somewhere I may have some photos of me with Chet Baker, but during that period of time, they were not, they weren't very healthy. Let's put it that way. They were doing
it was they were strung out, maybe.
Yeah, and I remember, I shouldn't even talk about it, but I remember when I had to go to the bathroom, and I went in the men's room there, and there they were,
shooting. No, dude, listen, I was working on a documentary on Stan Getz, and I forget who told me the story, but Buell Neidlinger. I'm not sure if you ever had a chance to play with that cat, but he was like,
Oh, I know who he is.
yeah, I mean, they were all just like on the Jersey Turnpike, and Buell's like nodding off, and Stan's like, "Hey, Buell, you got any more?" I mean, it was just horrible. It was just crazy, man. Very, very,
Yeah.
very junk time, you know.
That part of it was not
Yeah.
attractive. However, being that young and seeing that, it really woke me up.
It was
So
instructive.
luckily,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
some of that, just later on when the things, got even weirder, like in the '60s, is something I've managed to avoid that. Thinking back to what was going on, in the '50s that I, sort of witnessed firsthand, which has nothing to do with the music, but that's a little side story.
Well, I mean, let's face it. I mean, there was that misconception that everyone wanted to sound like Bird, and they thought that to do that, you had to be on junk. It was just kind of weird. I want to go back. What about the Red Hill Inn? Did you go there?
That was in Camden.
It was, I don't know. Randy Brecker said he went there with his dad and saw Miles was playing with like a Harmon mute there. Like it was cool. There was like a lot of like, I guess like Barry, like, I mean, you know what? I want to having such a great time already. We have a game on this program called Name That Voice. I don't expect you to necessarily know who this is, although maybe you definitely played with him, but take a listen to it and then we'll come back.
Eddie's playing, as was Roy Haynes's and Pete LaRocca's and many of the guys of my experience in the early '60s and beyond. They were inviting conversation. They were insisting on conversation. What they were doing with the bass drum was not written in a book somewhere at all. When they hit the bass drum, they were inviting a response, and often it fell to the bass player to furnish that response, and then that in turn provoked and the next bass drum hit, and so on. That's simply, it was just understood that's how the rhythm section functioned, and it was a departure. It was not the way Tommy Parter and Max played exactly, although what they were playing tended in that direction. I mean, in 1959 played with Kenny Clark. Luckily,
Kluk.
I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, well, so talk about
that experience that kind of conversational environment with him, and obviously that was something he'd been doing since the early '40s, maybe even the late '30s. So we're looking at a.
Barry, you want to take a guess at who that is?
I have no idea who that is, except whatever he's saying is very enlightening and very.
I love it. No, sir, you're enlightening too. That was my first interview with a dear man, and he's still with us, Steve Swallow.
Oh yeah, sure.
And
Wonderful.
I mean, Barry, like this is a lost art in all music today. But I just wanted you to talk about your own experience. I mean, you were. I guess a child prodigy is probably fair to say. I know you're a really humble person, but you were playing professionally. I guess you were part of the union at 10 years old, maybe. I don't know. Can you just talk about how you learned to dance on the kit, and more specifically, like feather the bass drum, like the feathering, the what he's talking about? He was talking about Eddie Marshall. Like when I listen to Eddie Marshall play, like. It's not in a book what he's playing, but it feels so good. And I just wanted you to talk about your own way, the way you, I mean, there was no academy, so to speak. I mean, this was like, can you talk about how you made up your own rhythm?
But it was a language that you sort of developed, through the tradition of the different players. Now, I was very aware of musicians from the times before me, from like the 20s and the 30s, the swing era, and then, going into, bebop. And some of those players really, influenced me, especially Max Roach, who, when you're saying like normally, musicians, drummers would, in the beginning, it might have been a very set thing where you keep the hi-hat on 2 and 4.
Right.
And sometimes swing era, the bass drum was just boom, 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 with an occasional offbeat kind of thing if it was written into the arrangement in a way. But, the drummers, especially, in the bebop era, starting with Kenny Clark and then, with Max, and then you're talking about Art Blakey, and then certain people who really changed it up with the hi-hat, like Charlie Persip and Roy Haynes, and even Phil Joe, that led the way for, people like me to say, hey, there's another way to approach this while still keeping the groove. The important thing is it's got to, as they, they always say, it's got to swing.
No, I totally dig, man. But it's got to be comfortable. I just love that. So what was Persip and Roy and those guys doing with the high? I mean, they were not necessarily relying on the bass drum to keep time. I mean, break it down.
No, the bass drum was an accent. In other words, you would play. It would be basically like in between the beat, or it would accentuate,
right,
the specific times. And the same thing with the snare drum. So the kick drum and the snare would sort of play opposite each other, and that was a conversation within itself. And then with the ride cymbal, back in the day, everything was like ding, 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 ding. That would change up. So in other words, you would have all of these different things, but it had to be understood where one is and where the beat is, and not the way of, you're listening to the other players, especially the soloist, whether it be a sax player or the piano player or whatever, and you can't, let, in other words, you have to anchor things at the same time you're conversing with them and sort of egging them on in a way, where what that culminated in, and in my time when I was playing in the 60s, the person that exemplified that to me the most was Tony Williams, and he was sort of like the combination of all of those people that I had mentioned, the Charlie Persip and the Roy Haynes and the Philly Joe, and I know he had studied with Alan Dawson up in because he was from the Boston area, and so when Tony started playing with Jackie McLean, like around 1962, and then you hear him in '63 playing with Herbie Hancock, and then eventually, obviously, with with Miles all through the mid '60s, all the way to around the time of the Tony Williams' lifetime. So that whole style of drumming evolved, and now it's evolved into many, many other things with some of the younger players that are doing amazing things. But still, the drums have to be, a part of the rhythm section, and they have to be able to communicate and become a team with the bass in particular, because it's the same thing. Sometimes you have to share it a little bit. Like the bass might just anchor and just walk or play a set pattern, and the drums can just go off and do other things. And other times the drums can be, very, very on the beat and let the bass do some things. But it's sort of thinking on your feet. There isn't any particular pattern or, rule that, in other words, you're just using your improvisational skills and your communication skills and your listening and sharing. And that's what, jazz is basically all about that,
Well, I mean, talking to a guy who, Barry Miles was in the car seat as a young boy. His feet were going back and forth to the windshield wipers. I mean, you obviously you had like incredible inner time feel. How was it, like when you, just as a younger cat, like, I mean, really young, can you talk about how much and I'm not talking about like, going in the bathroom and like seeing people strung out, but can you just talk about the jazz community? I'm not sure if you ventured into W. Eugene Smith's loft in Midtown, or I'm just trying to figure out, like, to me, like, the thing I love the most, I love the music, but I actually think the musicians I love more because it just seemed like it was a subculture and it was it was basically a black subculture, but it was a family. Did you feel totally accepted, or were there times where like you kind of had to just sort of tune out the drama needle, so to speak?
I was totally accepted by the musicians, and yes, it was primarily a black community, especially where like we're talking about the closest connection to me was Newark, New Jersey,
Sure.
and a television show called Art Ford's Jazz Party, which we may have talked about many years ago.
I don't think so. Wait, what was the guy's name?
Art Ford. And
you know who we talked about was who we talked about was Harry Abramson. We didn't talk about this guy though.
Oh right, yeah. Well, I'm looking at a poster right now. This is from 1968, and it's a jazz concert at the Mosque Theater, and it's November 29th, 1958. The headliner is Miles Davis Sextet and also Chris Connor, the vocalist.
Sure.
And there's Horace Burr is on it. Jimmy Smith is on it. Miles's band is Paul Chambers, Bill Evans, John Coltrane, Red Garland, Jimmy Cobb, and Cannonball. Underneath that, it says little Barry Miles, 11-year-old.
Wait, you're on the marquee. You're on the bill.
I'm on the gig.
This is I need a picture of that, man. That's epic.
I'll have to send you that.
Oh my God.
Art Ford was sort of like a radio guy. Was an MC. What I'm getting at is, I played. I didn't play with Miles on that, but it was a local band that I was playing with, and I can't remember. I think I was playing drums, and I might have played a little piano, but the sax player on the gig was Wayne Shorter. Okay, so he was like a local Newark guy at that time, but he was already developing his own thing, and he was very he had all his stuff together. Anyhow, what I'm getting at, there was a TV show called Art Ford's Jazz Party, which the MC of this concert was Art Ford, and I remember playing on that show maybe 5 or 6 times, and they were all different. He would have the most unusual combination of musicians, everyone from, we'll say like someone like Willie the Lion Smith playing with Ornette Coleman, or Cannonball playing with Earl Hines. In other words, it was a whole community of musicians that came in. Some of them were local musicians who were great, like King Curtis, and like Vinnie Burke, who was a great bass player, and I'm trying to think of some of the other. But I remember doing that show, and there was Billie Holiday I played with Billie Holiday on that show, and Lester Young was on there, and Cannonball, and all these different people, and they were all really accepting of me. They weren't obviously like I'm a little kid, but once they heard me play, or they knew by word of mouth that yes, I could do this, it was totally encouraging, and it was totally like part of whatever musical family was there. And that both black and white. I remember going into New York and sitting at the Hickory House with Marion McPartland, with Jake Hanna on drums, and Bill Crow on bass, and that they were, all of these people were welcoming and nice, really kind. And
that's so beautiful. I mean, that to me is like what it's all about, and I just think that is just so incredibly beautiful. I mean, would you say that that when did you actually join the union?
Well, in 1956, so I was 9 years old. I think I still have the paper.
9 years. You were 9 years old. Now, were you? Can you talk about some of the? When was the first time you actually? Were you doing? I remember talking to. Did a couple interviews with Mike Mainieri. He was like, deeply ensconced in in the TV studios, but he won some contest with a folk duo or folk gig, and that's how he got in. I mean, were you doing jingles or commercials at all, or was the first?
Not really. There may have been a couple of commercials, but it was really, some concerts and some TV things like the Andy Williams show, and Chubby Jackson had a show on ABC that I was on a number of times. I think the very first one that I did was called the Ted Steele show, and he was, I think he was the husband of Allison Steele, who became a radio, disc jockey. And I remember the drummer. I did a drum battle with Gary Chester, who was a great drummer.
Whoa, hold on wait a minute, dude. Wait a minute. This is on radio, or this was Chubby Jackson's television show?
No, this was the Ted Steele show. That was the first one that when you asked what was the first TV show that I did, and that was the Ted Steele show.
And you did a drum battle with Gary Chester.
Yeah.
Oh my God, man! That dude, really seminal rock studio drummer. The guy he could play jazz though.
Oh, he could play everything. He
Wow.
was sort of like the Steve Gadd of his day.
Yeah, right.
He played everything that you could think of, and he, great big band drummer, and and I guess the show had a house band, and he was the drummer in it. And then when I came on and played, with the band, and then we sort of traded fours and stuff like that.
How ultimately talk a little bit about? I mean, you were undaunted as a youngster and accepted by your elders or even people that were older than you, but talk a little bit about if there was any real decision process as to why you actually did go over to various keyboards, piano, et cetera, and was it mainly just because Terry was becoming an amazing drummer, or was it something more that had to do with maybe just being able to sing for your supper and there was this whole thing about, I just have talked to so many, Joe Chambers especially, there was this sort of common knowledge or this stereotype that drummers couldn't be band leaders, and I wonder about why you, if that was one reason you consciously switched over to piano full time as a band leader.
Well, that had nothing to do with it, because again, like the people that influenced me were drummers who were all band leaders, like Chico Hamilton and like Max Roach and Art Blakey. So that wasn't the reason. That it's probably sort of inevitable in a way that I would sort of slowly drift towards playing piano primarily for a number of different reasons. First of all, the first instrument that I really played was the piano. I started lessons when I was 5 years old or so, and then I sort of started playing drums maybe when I was about 7 or so. Now, as far as why I played professionally on the drums primarily at that time, it's hard for me to give an answer to that. However, going forward, by the time in the around 1964, 1963, 64 or so, I was really starting to do a lot of my own original writing. Now, even on the first album that I did in 1961, when I played drums, and most of those compositions, all of those compositions were my own. So I was already writing, bebop tunes or whatever it is during that period of time. And as I developed my writing skills, the music changed, got more into the, melding of different styles and sort of an early version of whatever fusion music became, but it was acoustic. And so I was very much, into the harmonic things, and, but the drums were real important to me because of rhythmically, I had that basis as well. So by 1966, I did a concert where I was a freshman in college by that time at Princeton University, and I did a concert there with Lou Soloff and Robin Kenyatta.
Wow.
And
wow.
and Walter Booker was playing bass.
Wow.
And this is like 1966, and they were all original compositions. And for whatever reason, I couldn't find, I couldn't get a piano player for the gig. So, what I'm going to play, going to do this concert on piano, and I got a drummer. His name is Don Perullo, a wonderful musician, and he had studied with Charlie Persip, and his style of playing was very free and very, very,
elastic. Yeah.
Yeah, he was wonderful. So we did this concert, and it ended up being called a syncretic music concert because I was the syncretic sort of meant to me the same thing that fusion does. It was just a word before we used the word fusion.
Absolutely.
Which I don't
absolutely.
like label or anything like that, but it was just sort of like, sort of a melding of a lot of different styles into some other style or, sound that's kind of unique. And it felt so good playing on that therefore afterwards I did mostly things on the piano. And then when Terry came along, which is only a year or two after that, it was like, okay, like this, Terry's just like an amazing musician and drummer, and he had the whole concept because we just played, we jammed together in the basement, like all of those years when he was a little kid, when he was 11, 12 years old. So by the time he was 14, which was in 1971, he was ready to do, had a contract with Mainstream Records and the album White Heat, which had Pat Martino on. So Terry played on that, and he was like 14 at that time. But there wasn't anybody else, who could do that. The only other person I could possibly think of at that time was Tony Williams, and I knew I wasn't going to get him to play on that.
I got to tell you something, Barry. Like, it's so funny because you didn't listen to my second interview with Terry, but he said we were talking about it because the relentless amount of woodshedding that you guys did in the basement. He knew the tunes. He was obviously very good. And I said, he said the only other cat that could probably have pulled that off was Tony Williams.
That's right.
It's unbelievable, man. That is the greatest. Then I just for the history books, Barry Miles, did you ever record as a sideman drummer at all in the studio for somebody else as a leader?
Ooh, I'm trying to think, but I don't think so. No.
Interesting. I guess it wasn't like you really had to necessarily make a living and pay rent. You were still living it. I mean, you were still a 10, 12. I mean, we're talking when you were 10 or 11 or 12
right.
years. I mean, it wasn't like you had to pay for an apartment or something like that,
Right. I was still, obviously in grammar school or junior high, it was during that period of time. And I couldn't play in clubs and stuff, so as far as the recording that I did on the drums, I think the only thing would have been that album on the Charlie Parker record label with Duke Jordan was playing piano, and Al Hall, great bass player, played with Charlie Parker, was playing bass, and John Glazell, great trumpet player, is no longer with us. He became the president of Local 802, the musicians union in New York.
Wow.
And a mentor of mine, Bob Miller, Robert Miller, who's a sax player and a great arranger, and he was very influential, to.
This is really important. I mean, like fusion is these albums that started to crop up with Barry Miles. I mean, did you? I have to believe. I mean, I spent some time out in Los Angeles with great session musician Craig Durgee, and he's married to Judy Henske, right? This folk singer, and she said that her first gig at the Village Gate, Herbie was on, I think, Wurlitzer or piano, and Keeter Betts was on bass. And I'm just like,
wow.
And I'm like, did Barry Miles? I mean, I'm like thinking that, I don't think that you were, clearly. Did you play rock or folk gigs? Ultimately, Al Di Meola told me. I mean, he goes, Barry Miles was the first fusion cat. And so you're talking about fusing, there's classical, jazz, but also did you wind up supporting in a live context? Like, what was your most non-jazz sort of gig in that mid-'60s period?
Oh,
Or were you just a total purist? I mean, that's fine too, you know?
no, absolutely not. I love, the rock music of that time. But again, some of it goes back a little bit, before
Yeah,
that.
do it, man. Yeah.
I'm looking at this other poster. I only got two of them up in this room. But right next to the one that I mentioned, it's called a Rock and Roll Festival.
Oh.
And this is from 1956.
Oh, my God.
And the headliners are a singing group, like a doo-wop group called the Heartbeats.
Oh,
I think they even made them. And they had a big hit called 1,000 Miles Away or something like that. And I'm on that bill. I'm playing on that concert.
Oh, no, you're not. That is so ridiculous. Wait, your band? You had a band at that time? You had a rock band?
Oh, boy. I can't remember, but I do know that I played a lot, and not really on any gigs. It was more like sitting in, because I couldn't play, I couldn't be hired to play in the club or something.
I know, I get it, yeah.
But King Curtis, who before Aretha Franklin, and he, as I say, he was a Newark guy, and he would play, and I can't remember what clubs he played at. And he was just like, it was R&B, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, Chuck Rainey was in his band for a minute, yeah.
Right. So, we're talking about, it wasn't necessarily like rock and roll, although, yes, I did, cross paths with a lot of, like, I remember doing a gig opposite Frankie Lyman.
Yeah, I love this. This is what I love. Yeah. Oh, this is great.
So, I mean, definitely, was involved in some way, with the whole rock thing going on. But this was more like it in the 50s. And then there was another guy who was also on the bill for that rock concert, a guy named Bobby Jarrett. He was a great saxophone player. And I think, who I played with on that concert, there was another saxophone player. It says hot saxophone man, Space Washington.
Oh, you are you're going deep in the bag right now. Space Washington, man.
Yeah.
Oh, did you ever? I mean, I know Pat. I'm thinking of Pat right now. I mean, he played with Lloyd Price for a while. Did
Yep.
you? I mean, there was like, you never went on like any of those R&B or Chitlin Circuit kind of gigs. I mean, did you ever travel? Did you ever kind of go on the road at all early on? I mean, taken under the wing.
Early on. Yeah. Pat was a bit older than me, so he could. By that time, he did, what they call like the Chitlin Circuit, and he played all of those gigs for organ trio, things like that. So like his roots go, back to that, and mine, are part of that, but I didn't actually tour with that. It was much later on, in touring with different, after. When I basically became a keyboard player, and then not until like the very early 80s, like working with, for many years with Roberta Flack.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's, I mean, this is, I got another Name That Voice for you. This is something I played for Terry, and then this was when he basically told me, I think my brother might have some real perspective on this. So take a listen to this, and we'll come back.
Okay.
Anyway, he said, well, because they had this term avant-garde, and they were talking about the so-called free. And he said, man, the free avant-garde music was what we were doing on Blue Note, not Shep.
Really?
And Albert Elliott and all that.
Really?
He said that. He said, man, and that was the first I heard of it back then, because those cats was doing their thing around, but I didn't say anything about them. Wasn't nobody putting them down. Now, except for Eric Dolphy doesn't belong in them class. Eric was a traditional musician. He knew changes. He knew everything. He could play. He played in the orchestra, in the American Symphony Orchestra. So he's separate from them dudes. Even like Train is separate. But them cats, even Shep and Albert, them cats couldn't play no tunes. They couldn't play no changes.
Okay, this is really
Shep
important.
just
So
started
Crouch,
learning
going back to
changes.
Crouch, rest in peace, Stanley Crouch. He identified these mid-'60s Blue Note albums as the real avant-garde stuff because there were
Right.
they were actual tunes.
Well, yeah, because you could hear all the tradition in what we were doing. We could swing, we could play the blues, and we played changes. We was running through changes. We just stretched it out. But them cats couldn't do that.
Well, what could they do that was inspired? Were you inspired by
What
them?
they could do is
Yeah.
what they did. What they did, that's what they could do.
Well, what were they doing? Was it noise?
Yeah.
It was noise. Okay.
What they call altissimo. It's called altissimo, the squeaks and squawks.
All right, Mr. Miles, you want to take a guess at who that is?
Yeah. Well, no, I can't.
I know, no, you have no clue. That was my second interview with Joe Chambers, the drummer, and I just was like, like it was revelatory, Barry, because at 43, my generation and younger, like the folklore is that the real free jazz movement pioneers are Ornette, obviously, but you get Eiler and you get Shep, and yet to know that the cats, he was talking about the mid-'60s Blue Note albums like Andrew Hill and Bobby Hutcherson, Joe Henderson. He said that Stanley Crouch said that was the real avant-garde music. And there's no right or wrong answer, but what was revelatory was just the idea that the guys in the studio, like Chambers and those cats, didn't really respect what Eiler and Shep were doing just because, like you said, they couldn't play changes, they couldn't play the blues, they couldn't back up a singer at radios, they really couldn't keep a gig. And I just interviewed Mickey Tucker and he toured with Shep later on in the 80s and Shep was playing it was incredible. So, you wonder how much they just sort of were tired. I guess the bottom line is this, that I wanted you to, because you sort of straddled this line of fusion and syncretic music, but what Mickey was saying was like that basically guys like Eiler and Shep, like they were tired of the metric that you were a legitimate jazzer was that you had to know every song in the American songbook. And then they just sort of went out there and they took it to a different place. Now, a lot of the cats that were on the scene that tried to sing for their supper playing jazz agree with Joe Chambers. And I just kind of wanted you to talk from your perspective, being that you were basically on the scene when Ornette was starting. I mean, you brought up that 56 album and, you saw the evolution of free jazz, and I just wanted you to talk about where you come down on those cats that sort of now seem to get a lot of credit for pioneering this movement.
Well, I agree with Joe on a lot of those points. I can't personally speak about, Archie Shep or, Albert Eiler or exactly how many tunes they knew or whether they didn't know.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
We touched upon this earlier today in this interview where I said the people that I played with who were into the free form, who dabbled in that, were all master musicians. And they did know, they were trained musicians.
Exactly.
Like Eric Dolphy, and talking about someone like Eddie Gomez, who was, did his whole classical thing at Juilliard and was, obviously knew, changes, which were real important, and, or, people who, I played with, we're talking about rehearsing with Chick Corea. Here's somebody who, has gone through all kinds of things with the free form thing, but it was based upon these musicians understanding and absorbing the music that came before them and really woodshed and knew how to do all of those things. And I can't make a judgment on, there were lots of players that I knew that, and they're not necessarily well known, who were shucking and jiving in the sense that they couldn't play any tunes and they didn't have the right technique and they didn't know what the heck they were doing. So they just decided, I'm going to play. This is a good, freeform is a good thing for me to latch onto because it's a free ride.
That's how, I think Jake Feinberg might have been on that train, dude. But yeah, thank God I didn't. No, I'm with you, man. It was a way to. But so, how did you try? Because White Heat gets kind of, some of those tunes get free. But I mean, it's really a matter of having your rudiments in place and knowing that the history and being able, I mean, how did you play, how did you try to, those albums conceptually, like where it would get free, but it would still be, understandable to a listener. You could still hear the tradition in the music.
Yeah, well, those albums, the things that I did like in the early 70s, or even this syncretic album, almost, there are sections where it's like free form, but there was a structure to them. And so, in other words, with either you were improvising on, motifs or chord changes, it depended on each song. I mean, one song was, called Exposition and Development, and it had a specific, form sort of based upon a classical, the old symphonic forms and things. And then other ones were, where I would tell the musicians that we're going to play these motifs. You can do them, you can play it backwards, forwards, and whatever it is. And some of them we were playing changes. So each song had a different thing. Now, the White Heat album, for the most part, there were changes. We were playing on chords, except we can really, use that as a structure and then get very free around that structure using your musical skills. So, each thing was, quite different. Each song, each composition was quite different. But I always like to incorporate a lot of, the harmonic interest and the, structure within it. To me, just to do everything completely free at all times that wasn't really for me. Yet there were certain things, we're talking about Ornette. Now it's unclear, say, well, could Ornette play a tune? Could he, was just sort of like, could he play bebop? Could he, I don't know,
right.
But I do know that he had a very unique sound, and that his compositions, they're very beautiful. They just as a tune, as a song, some of those things, they're just like gorgeous pieces. And a lot of musicians, will say like Pat Metheny or whatever, have taken his music and just made it their own and extrapolated on it. And so Ornette had something to say. And I know a lot of musicians at that time didn't, or at least appeared, they rejected that. I remember going one time to hear Ornette at the Village Vanguard, and this must have been, oh boy, I couldn't even tell you. It probably was in the 60s, late 60s. And I remember Max Roach and Charlie Mingus came in, and they sort of commandeered the stage. They just like walked up and started just like banging, like playing what sort of protest-free music, sort of saying, this is nonsense. I mean, musically saying that this is nonsense. So like, here, we're just going to play like random crap, And then they played for about 5 minutes, and then they walked out. It was like, whoa.
That is it. Wait. They walked in and started basically trying to, they were adding to the sonic palette of the concert, or just trying to get in his head?
No, they just sort of like, either Ornette was like, I can't remember whether it was during a break or whether they weren't playing with Ornette. In other words, it was Ornette's gig, but they sort of just went on the stage and started doing this stuff. And then they walked out, and it was almost like saying, what you're playing is, BS or something. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe they were like totally. I have no idea.
I mean, Swallow in that interview, Swallow said the same thing. He was absolutely distraught when he first heard Ornette. Then I forget exactly the quote, but it's sort of, it's really interesting to just, sort of go back and did you have a chance to ever hang or have conversations with Bill Evans?
No, and it's sad because we actually went to the same high school.
Really?
We grew up in the same, but it obviously would have been much older than me, maybe 15 years older or something. I don't know. If Bill Evans was alive today, I don't know how old he would be, 90 or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what year he was born, but a lot of the musicians that, I knew in North Plainfield when I was a kid all had played with Bill Evans. I remember the guy who I mentioned before, Bob Miller, who was a big mentor to me, and he told me a few years ago, he said, yeah, we used to go up and down Route 22, which was like this, highway, and they're looking for gigs, and nobody would hire us, And Bill was trying to just get a gig, while he was still, in North Plainfield during that period of time. So there is a definite connection between, me and Bill Evans, and we studied for a while with the same classical piano teacher, Alda Von Till, who was in Highland Park, New Jersey. There was another guy, Bill Holiday, who was a great bass player who really was very close with Bill. So they all sort of knew each other, but that's a little bit before my time. By the time I was, playing and stuff, Bill, we're talking about later in the 50s, so I never really got a chance to be with him.
Is Don Miller a bass player? I'm sorry,
Bob Miller.
Bob Miller, yeah.
Yeah, sax player,
alto sax player.
He has a whole history of himself. He played in the range with like Claude Thornhill and a lot of different people. He was just a wonderful musician,
Barry, I wanted to ask you about the opportunity that you had. This album that came about called Magic Theater. Was that done in the States or was that an overseas? Can you talk about how that came to be? I was not really that hip to that album, but it is burning.
I love the song Magic Theater. The record company didn't want me to put that on there because it was so long and stuff. I said, I don't care.
I love that you actually put your foot down. Normally, that you actually had the creative control.
Yeah, for that particular thing. That was recorded in, it's London Records, but it was recorded in New Jersey at Venture Recording Studio, which is in Hillsborough, New Jersey. And I did a lot of studio work for Tony Camillo, who's a great producer and a great arranger, and he had his own studio, and he sort of was, I guess, the producer of that album, and he just let me do whatever I wanted. He was just, a wonderful person and musician. He passed away a few years ago. And my connection with him, was, again, as I say, tons of studio work where he'd bring in musicians from New York, like Mike and Randy Brecker and all of the horn players and all of the rhythms, Steve Gadd and, the whole lot of people. Bob Babbitt was the bass player. He was he was one of the, what do they call it, the guys from Detroit.
He was one of the Funk Brothers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he was there. And we recorded like 2 years before that. That album was from 1975. 2 years before that, I played on Midnight Train to Georgia, the Gladys Knight, which was my part, and the band was actually recorded in that studio. And then Tony took the tapes to Detroit and supposedly recorded her remotely outside of a hotel room because she was on the road or something like that. And I never got a chance to meet her until like a few years ago. And I knew that the Pips were there when I recorded, but not her. So it was great. She said, "Oh, Barry, I always wanted to meet you." When you hear that acoustic piano in the front of that tune, that's me.
Wow, man. So they took the rhythm tracks and just brought them over and then put her vocals on it.
Yeah. So, but anyhow, that album, the Magic Theater album, was done in that studio. And, it was a comfortable situation because I didn't live far from there, and the band, my group was, we were doing gigs and performing, so it was, a working band, at that time. But unfortunately, the record company never really promoted it, so it just sort of, it's not really, it was never reissued.
Yeah, I mean, it's a diamond in the dude. I have a beautiful copy that's down here in Tucson where I live, and it was just like, wow, this is really. I just we're gonna have to do another set because I really want to get into to the Diana Ross and the Motown or the R&B side of your career. But I before I let you go on this one, we've lost like Barry Harris and Pat and Chick Corea and so many titanic musicians over this period of time. And even if the pandemic didn't hit us, we still could have lost these people. It's not like, they lived very hardy lives. But I just kind of wanted you to talk to younger cats who are not, it's a different paradigm now. Clearly, most 10-year-olds are not going to be playing rock concerts or jazz concerts or, and just in general, the opportunities for live playing are so limited. You don't have a lot of intellectual property rights anymore. There isn't much of a studio scene. Basically, the only way you can make money as a musician today is by going on road dogging it and then selling merchandise at the gigs. But for the cats and my peers and guys on this journey, I've really started to connect with a lot of my own peers, and it's been cathartic. But a lot of them are not in a great place psychically because they, their yoga, their meditation is on the bandstand. And I just kind of wanted you to, not that you've had experience, this is a once in a lifetime pandemic, but what would be some sort of inspiration from Barry Miles for people who are questioning whether, even though they feel like it's their purpose in life and they have to do it, what would you say? Can you give a little inspiration to people about staying the course, especially if music feeds them spiritually?
It's a good question. It's a very difficult answer to that, and nobody really has the answer to what that is. I have to be optimistic in some way as far as the future generation or the young generation right now. First of all, there's some amazingly talented people that are out there who are young. There's older people and middle-aged people, whatever it is, but there's a great group of young people and a lot of them who have absorbed the music that came before them and have really put in their homework and really worked hard at it and are doing some amazing music. And so, the hard part is right now is creatively is with music like jazz or something. It's you playing live with other people is the most important thing. The communication between the players, and that's become very, very difficult. You can do a lot of this stuff online, like overdub things and do a Zoom thing. It's hard with the technology is not there. There's what they call latency. So when you play a note, the other guy hears it. It's already later.
That's right.
It's a group.
Totally.
Right away. You can't swing with that. So there has to be another way to be able to do that, at least for the time being, until people can gather together and play again. Then there's the whole other side of it, which is the economic problem, where, as you say, the music basically now is free. In other words, you can put something out, and it's going to wind up, on online streams, whether it's legal or illegal or whatever. There's no way to stop that. So the only way I can be optimistic is to say that in spite of all of that, the technology, the economy, or economic reasons, financial reasons, that the younger generation, the creativity that they have musically, they'll also in some fashion be able to find a way around that and to make a living doing that, because you can't, as you say, you can't support yourself if the music is free and you're not going to be paid for it, and people are stealing it left and right. They're trying with the intellectual property right now. I forget what they call that. With paintings and stuff, where you can buy a digital version of it, and they're already stealing that stuff. It's already become bootleg of that. So it's not trickling down to the creators of it. There's a ton of money in the music industry, but it's not getting down to the to the actual, musicians themselves or the creators of it. And there's a lot of people out there who are really trying. Maria Schneider, who's done some, amazing things with not only, her music, but just, dealing with Congress and, dealing with the government and trying to, get, the people to be able to be compensated for the work that they do and not having it, being.
Well, I mean, I just want to leave you with this question. We can pick it up in our next segment, but it's like, the question really is, Barry, is a musician still seen as a viable profession in our country today? I mean, is music a musician's gift to the world, or is it still seen as a viable profession? I mean, it's my goal at this point to go all in for the authentic creative cats, because it's a different, I mean, it seems to me, I remember when I interviewed Charlie Persip, when he was on the road with Dizzy, they used to get so upset because they'd be like, we're not playing, man. We're not playing music. This is hard work. Like, we need to be compensated for our work. But somehow people are like, well, you can play for the door or you can pay to play. And, like, that is, a musician in my mind is absolutely integral in our society, in our commerce. And I just pray that, we'll pick it up next time, but that to me is the overarching part of it, is if it's not trickling down and you're not getting your intellectual property and you have to, pay to play or play for the door, what does that say about how they view musicians as a profession, as our society does? That's the biggest issue.
Don't. I mean, it always was that way. Now it's worse. And right now, it's not viable, except maybe for a handful of people, at the top echelon who, whether they have a name to be able to do that and to parlay that into a career. But for young people starting out, it's very, very difficult. My hope is, as I say, that there'll be a way to be able to control that, and that musicians can, make a living doing that. And if they can't, I don't know where that'll go, but it won't be necessarily in our lifetime. In other words, like 50 years from now, what will that be? Will it'll just be a hobby for everyone, and
right.
And that's the end of it? People won't stop being creative, and I can see that, in people like Eldar and Jacob Collier, who are doing some amazing things online, but they've been able to actually work. But these are people who are like beyond genius. I mean, they're just like so brilliant that they can do that.
And then the bottom line is like, it's like it's really, it's like you need, we need bands, we need a domestic touring circuit. We need, there's a lot of things. And anyway, I'm on my crusade, and I love Barry Miles, man. You just we blew through the last hour and 10 minutes, man. It was so much fun. I'm so glad we reconnected, man.
Well, I'm as they've been saying, thank you for having me. And,
no, let's do it. Let's do it again. Let this breathe for a minute, but then let's do another set, man. We got a lot more to do.
Definitely. When was the last time we did that?
Barry, honestly, Barry, it was like spring 2011, man.
I had a feeling, yeah. So we're talking about
11 years, man. It's almost 11 years, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll do it before that, okay?
Oh, no. I mean, I'm talking like next couple months, definitely.
Definitely.
Right.
Just so you know, so many people appreciate what you've done through the years, and to archive all of this, and so what you're doing is in its own right a really important thing. So just keep doing it and take care of yourself, and until we meet again.
Absolutely,
okay?
Barry. Much love to you, brother. Be safe, man.
Okay, Jake.
Be cool, man. Later. Bye. Barry Miles, beautiful to reconnect after 11 years, but it was sure fun. We'll be back.